so I should probably try to speak for a little less than that, but we'll see how we go. I'm Jonathan Robarts, as Oscar has said. My role at Network Rail is I'm the Director of Planning and Regulation, which basically involves doing three things. I'm responsible for putting together the company's strategic business plan. We, as I'm sure you all know, are a regulated company, so there's a process of funding that business plan, and I'm responsible for that process. And then more broadly, I'm responsible for the relationship with our regulator on the economic rather than the safety side. On the topic of fares and financing, I can talk quite a lot about the financing of Network Rail and the funding of Network Rail. We don't run any train services, so fares is not my bag, so you may be terribly disappointed from an industry point of view. I'll make a couple of comments about fares, but largely what I'd like to talk about is a bit about infrastructure costs and what's driving the funding of Network Rail, which is a key part of the industry. The first thing I should probably say is Network Rail hasn't had a great few months, and certainly last month or so. We caused significant disruption to passengers over Christmas, and we're not achieving the improvements we need, and we are working incredibly hard at learning the lessons from that and looking to move forward in a much better way. That won't be instant, but there's a huge amount of work going on that, and I thought it was important that I say that in terms of setting context for where we are today. But having said that, in thinking about financing of the railway industry and looking over a longer period, I think the railway has a really positive story in terms of what's been happening over the last 10, 15 years. And the first place to start looking at that is actually the number of people that are using the railway and the amount of freight that is being transported on the railway. And if you look at the history, as many of you will know, from around about the middle of the last century through to 1995, the level of usage on the railway declined significantly, and actually the amount of railway declined significantly. But since then, there has been the most enormous amount of growth. There has been somewhere in the region of 70% passenger growth over the last 15 years. There's been growth in freight traffic, and all of that looks set to continue. So that sets the platform for thinking about what might be driving cost in the railway and the way we're thinking about planning of the railway. So during that period of decline, in terms of usage, there was actually a pretty significant level of underinvestment in the railway. Why would you invest in a declining industry? So what we had was great railway put in Victorian times, but then underinvested in through much of the back end of the last century. But then we've seen the increase in growth. So what we have been doing over the last 10 years or so as Network Rail is, broadly speaking, three things. One, catching up on that underinvestment. We've done a huge amount to improve the quality of our assets through track signaling, the rest of the assets. So that is just enormous in scale. We've got some bits and pieces we still need to do around catching up in some areas, but we're a long way down that path. Second thing we need to be doing is actually modernising what is a Victorian railway. There's an awful lot of it that has got some pretty ancient technology. I'm not sure technology is the right word for some of it, actually. In the rail, there are still levers being pulled, and one of the things we have been doing, but we're really focusing quite hard on at the moment, is looking at how can we actually modernise the railway. And we have created a new programme to look at something we're calling the digital railway. Can we bring the railway much more into the 21st century, which will have significant benefit if we're able to do that. And then thirdly, we've done a huge amount to increase the capacity of the railway in terms of actually growing the infrastructure, but also growing the capability of the infrastructure in terms of the way we timetable and operate the railway. and that has enabled more people to travel, more rolling stock to be provided, and more services to run. And I think that last point is actually hugely important in terms of the investment in the capacity of the railway, because what I see over the last probably 10 years is actually government of different colours, all government, supporting the railway, and that they've recognised the importance of the railway to the economy. And sitting in a position as the railway man on this table, we really welcome that support and the recognition of the importance of the railway to the economy. So then, thinking about funding and financing, inevitably, nowhere else funding needs to reflect the need to pay for this investment. So while there has been a significant increase in investment over this time, actually our running costs and the cost of delivering work has come down pretty significantly over the last 10 years, and is set to do so going forward. So over a period to the roughly 2019, our costs over a 15-year period are expected to have come down by about 50%, which is a pretty sizable chunk in terms of the cost of running the railway. We then need to think a little bit. So how do we fund that? So the capacity benefits, the investment in those capacity benefits, actually will last many years into the future. So what we have is a framework using something called the regulatory asset base, which is a pretty standard means of funding regulated businesses. It's used in water, electricity industries, etc., which is a means by which we are able to spread the cost into our charges to train operators over many years into the future. So we effectively have the situation where the beneficiaries of those capacity enhancements are paying for them, rather than them just being paid for in charges on the day we're incurring them. But as a result of that, we need to borrow in order to finance that cost going forward. One of the other points I wanted to make about the level of investment is linked to the point about the benefit to the economy. So we do an awful lot of work in terms of justifying investment in the railway, and an awful lot of the analysis we do is not just pure financial analysis, because it is often not the case that there is a pure financial benefit of our investment. So we do not get a financial payback through farebox to cover the cost of that investment. And actually the justification for that investment is often the wider economic benefit that takes place. So one of the things that results from that is we pick up the tab for that, our costs go up, but the benefit doesn't all land in income coming into the industry. So you get costs going up, income not into the railway not going up by twice as much, and everyone says, crikey, isn't the railway expensive? So one of the things we actually need to think about, and we've been talking to governments about, is actually how do we deal with that? Are there different ways of funding and financing that economic benefit bit of the investment in the railway, so that you get a truer representation of when the benefits are forming and matching costs and benefits. And we will see where we get to on that. Last couple of points I will make. I'll give a very fine summary of some of the flows around the industry. So an important point from an industry perspective, if we look back 10 years, the level of subsidy coming into the railway was about £7 billion a year. Last year it was somewhere in the region of £4 billion a year. If you look over a period that goes back to early 90s, the level of subsidy was lower at the beginning of the 90s before the level of investment had increased. It's now back at that sort of level, but we are running pretty much twice as many, carrying twice as many passengers and a significantly larger number of train services around the network. So you've got to take into account what the railway is actually providing. Final point I will make is I'm not going to say much about fares, other than the fact that, as Oscar said, there are two sources of income into the railway. There's the subsidy and then there's fares through the fare box. There are other bits and pieces of income, but the choice of the balance between those is basically a political choice in terms of what that balance is. So in terms of my role and what I'm doing, I'm not involved in that choice at all. The very final point I wanted to make, actually our situation has changed in the last few months. You may know we've been reclassified as a public sector body. In the past, we've borrowed in the financial markets to fund the investment in the way I was describing. We are now actually borrowing direct from Treasury, and that changes some of the dynamics of what's going on. But largely speaking, our role remains exactly the same: to manage the infrastructure, to provide services to train operators, and to have a safer, better performing, sustainable railway. Thank you very much for listening.